The dispute started over a line in space that nobody could see. The Volkai hegemony had been pushing into the edge of Terran-claimed territory for 3 months. Small moves, quiet moves, a relay station placed just inside the border, a patrol route extended a few thousand kilometers too far, nothing big enough to call a war, just enough to make it clear they were testing something. High Arbiter Yuno of the Galactic Conclave had seen this before. Older species did it to younger ones all the time. It was practically a tradition. You pushed a little. The new species complained. You ignored the complaint. Eventually they accepted the new reality and everyone moved on. He expected the same from humanity. The emergency session had been called at Waypoint Aldris, a diplomatic station sitting in neutral space between 6 different civilizations. It was a large station, built in rings, and the central chamber where the conclave met could hold delegates from 40 species at once. On most days it smelled of a dozen different atmospheres being carefully filtered through shared ventilation. On that day it smelled like tension. The Volkai delegate, a broad-shouldered creature named Goss, sat at his assigned position with the comfortable posture of someone who already knew how the meeting would end. His people had been members of the conclave for 600 years. He had handled disputes like this before. The younger species always backed down. The human delegation sat across the chamber. There were 3 of them, a man named Aren, a woman named Sable, and a younger aide whose name nobody had bothered to learn. They did not look afraid. They did not look angry either. They looked, if anything, slightly tired, the way people look when they have been traveling too long and want to sit somewhere quiet. Yuno called the session to order. He laid out the situation in careful language. The border irregularities. The Volkai's stated position that the placements were navigational necessities and not territorial claims. The human formal objection filed 11 days ago. He spoke for a long time, the way arbiters do when they want everyone to feel that the process is being respected. Then he turned to the human delegation and asked them to present their response. Aren stood up. He was not a tall man. He had the kind of face that forgot easily, the sort of person you would not notice in a crowd. He cleared his throat and said, in a voice that was completely calm, that the human government would not be presenting a response in this chamber today. Yuno frowned. That was irregular. He asked what he meant. Aren said that the response had already been sent. It was, at that moment, in transit. A pause settled over the chamber. Yuno looked at the other delegates. Several of them shifted in their seats. Subenvoy Preth, Yuno's aide, leaned close and whispered that he didn't understand what the human meant. Had they sent a document, a formal counter-proposal? Aren heard the question. He shook his head slowly. Not a document, he said, a ship. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then the station's long-range sensor system sent an alert to every console in the chamber at once. The alert was not an alarm, not a warning. It was just a contact notification, the kind the system generated whenever something large dropped out of faster-than-light travel in the outer edges of the system. Analyst Sovi, who sat in the observer's gallery above the main floor, was the first one to pull up the sensor data on her personal screen. She was an intelligence officer, trained to read numbers quickly and without emotion. She read the numbers, then she read them again. Fleet Captain Gorzon, commanding the Conclave's escort fleet stationed just outside the station, received the same data at the same moment. He sat in his command chair and looked at the readout for a long time without speaking. His communications officer asked him twice if he wanted to respond to the contact. He didn't answer. He was still looking at the numbers. Back in the chamber, the Volkai delegate Goss had turned in his seat and was speaking quietly but quickly to his personal aide. His posture was not comfortable anymore. Yuno looked at the human delegation. The young aide at the back of their table was doing nothing unusual. She was sitting with her hands folded and her eyes forward, but there was something in the way she was sitting, not nervousness, not excitement. She already knew what was coming. Yuno kept his voice level. He asked Aren what ship had been sent. Aren picked up a small card from the table in front of him, as if he needed to check the name, though Yuno suspected he had it memorized long before he arrived. He said the name quietly. TES Ironville. The name meant nothing to anyone in the chamber. There was no record of it in the Conclave database, no known class, no registered tonnage, nothing. But the sensors knew it was there. Something had just arrived at the edge of the system. Something very large was now moving toward Waypoint Aldris, and it was not in any hurry. Yuno looked down at his console. He looked at the size estimate the sensors had returned. He looked at it for a long time. Then he set the console face down on the table in front of him and asked the chamber if they should perhaps take a short recess. Nobody objected. Fleet Captain Gorzin had fought in 2 wars and survived both of them. He was not a man who startled easily. He was staring at his sensor display, and he was very close to startled. The object moving through the outer system did not behave like most warships. Most warships, when entering a system with diplomatic activity, slowed down early and broadcast identification signals constantly. They wanted to be seen as non-threatening. They pinged back and forth with the station and made small, careful adjustments to their approach vector to show they were paying attention to the rules. This ship did none of that. It was not flying aggressively. It was not rushing. It was simply moving at a steady, unhurried pace, the way a very large animal walks through a space where nothing has ever threatened it. It had sent one identification signal at the moment it dropped out of FTL. One. And then nothing. No further communication. No course adjustments. Just a straight line toward the station, slow and even and absolutely certain of itself. Gorzin pulled up the size estimate again. The system had updated it twice since the first reading, each time with more confidence. 4.2 kilometers. That was not a patrol ship. That was not even a heavy cruiser by most standards. That was something that did not have a common name in the Conclave's classification system, because nothing that size was supposed to belong to a species that had only held provisional membership for 11 years. He opened a channel to his second officer and asked how long until visual range. 14 minutes, she said. He told her to have every sensor array on full passive. He did not want to send active pings toward the Ironville. Instinct, more than anything else, told him that pointing things at that ship without permission was not a good idea. Inside Waypoint Aldris, the recess had not brought any real calm to the chamber. Delegates stood in small groups in the hallways and corridors, speaking quietly. Analyst Sophie had not left her seat in the observer's gallery. She was working through the Conclave's full database on human military development, reading at speed, her eyes moving quickly down the text. The records were thin. Humanity's official naval registry, submitted when they applied for Conclave membership, listed a small collection of escort vessels and one mid-range defensive cruiser. Nothing that explained what the sensors were showing. Either the registry was incomplete or humanity had been building something in secret for a very long time. Sophie suspected the second one. Sub-Envoy Preth found her in the gallery and dropped into the seat beside her. He was a young official, not far into his career, and he had not yet learned to keep his face neutral when he was anxious. He asked her what she was finding. Not enough, she said, and that by itself is the problem. He asked what she meant. She said that when she looked at the history of human military development over the past 60 years, every major leap happened quietly. No announcements, no demonstrations, no public testing that outside observers could document. Humans built things and kept them until they needed them. She said it like it was an interesting observation. It was, in fact, making her deeply uneasy. The visual came in 14 minutes later, as predicted. On the main display screen in the conclave chamber, where delegates had reassembled in silence without anyone formally calling them back to session, the Ironville appeared. It was not what anyone had imagined. Most warships, even large ones, were built with a kind of lean efficiency. Long bodies, functional angles, the minimum amount of mass required to carry the weapons and crew. The Ironville was not lean. It was broad. It was layered. It had the look of something that had been built without compromise, as if whoever designed it had simply asked what would be needed and then built exactly that, without once asking whether it was too much. The hull was dark, a deep gray that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. Along the forward sections, heat signatures glowed faintly on the sensor overlay, visible even to the naked eye as a dull warmth. Those were not engine signatures. The engines were at the rear, running quietly. The heat at the front was from the weapons systems. They were not powering up. They were not targeting anything. They were simply on, at standby, running warm the way you keep an engine warm when you expect to use it soon. Gauss, the Volkai delegate, had not spoken since the recess. He was looking at the display. His aides said something to him in their own language. He did not respond. Gorzin opened a channel to the conclave chamber and reported that the Ironville had stopped at exactly the minimum required diplomatic approach distance from the station. Not 1 kilometer closer. Not 1 kilometer further. Exactly correct to the decimal. Yuno absorbed this. He had been a diplomat for 40 years. He understood the message in that precision. The humans had not parked their ship at that distance because they were being cautious. They had parked it there because they knew the rules better than anyone expected, and they were making sure everyone understood that. Preth leaned toward Yuno and whispered that he thought maybe they should send a formal greeting to the ship's commander. Yuno nodded slowly. Yes, he said, they should. He looked at the display for another moment before he sent the request. The Ironville sat in space and said nothing and waited, and somehow the waiting was the loudest thing in the room. Sophie had a habit, when she was trying to understand something, of writing down the thing that bothered her most and staring at it. She wrote, "They are not watching us watch them." She stared at it for a while. Then she pulled up the passive sensor feed that Gorzin's fleet had been running on the Ironville since it arrived and started going through the data point by point. The ship was fully crewed. She could tell that from the internal heat patterns and the low-frequency vibrations consistent with movement and machinery. Roughly 12,000 personnel, the estimate read, though that number had a wide margin. The fighters in the internal bays were warm too, not launched, not armed to full capacity, just sitting there the way tools sit on a shelf when someone fully intends to use them today but has not yet decided when. None of this was what caught her attention. What caught her attention was the routine activity. She had expected, given the situation, given the tension in the system, that a warship in this position would be at some heightened state of alert. Crew at stations, officers watching every sensor feed. The kind of tightness you could practically feel through a hull. She had been on conclave military vessels during border disputes. She knew what that looked like on a sensor sweep. The Ironville did not look like that. The heat patterns in the crew sections moved the way they moved during normal operations. People were eating, resting, moving between sections in the unhurried patterns of a shift change. In one section near the middeck, there was a cluster of bodies gathered in a configuration she recognized as a maintenance drill. Someone was teaching something to a group. In the rear recreation area, if the layout matched any standard human vessel design, there were people simply sitting. They had parked a 4.2-kilometer warship one step outside diplomatic range, in the middle of an active political crisis, and the crew was having lunch. Preth found the feed over her shoulder and watched it for a moment. He said, very quietly, that it was possible the humans simply were not worried. Sophie said she knew. That was exactly what was bothering her. Gorzin had come to the same conclusion from a different angle. He had been studying the Ironville's approach vector and drive signature during the transit through the system. The ship had not once varied from its original course. No sensor sweeps, No evasive adjustments, nothing that suggested the crew was watching the conclave escort fleet with any concern. Gorzin had 12 warships in this system. Good ones. The Ironville had given them approximately the same amount of attention a person gives to furniture in a familiar room. He sent a private message to his high command. He described the situation in careful language. He noted the ship's size, its weapons status, its behavior. Then he wrote at the end one sentence that he had not planned when he started the message. I do not think they sent this ship to threaten us. I think they sent it because it was the appropriate tool for the situation, and they simply have it. He sent the message and sat back and thought about what it meant that humanity simply had this. Inside the chamber, the atmosphere had changed in a way that was hard to describe. The session was technically still in recess. Nobody had called for it to formally resume, but the delegates had all drifted back to their seats anyway, because the corridor and the side rooms suddenly felt too exposed, too far from the screens that showed the Ironville sitting outside in the dark. Goss had not spoken to Yuno since the ship appeared. He had sent one message to his own government, 3 words long. Yuno did not know what it said. He could guess. The young human aide, the one at the back of the delegation table whose name nobody had asked, was reading something on a small personal device. She had been doing so for the past hour. At one point she smiled at something on the screen and made a quiet sound, the short exhale of someone who found something genuinely funny. Then she went back to reading. Yuno watched her for longer than he should have. He had dealt with many delegations from many species over 40 years. There were patterns. When a species sent a show of force, their diplomats performed nervousness carefully, watched the room, managed the tension with practiced precision. It was theater. You were supposed to feel the weight of the weapon and the restraint of the hand holding it at the same time. The human aide was not performing anything. She was reading and occasionally smiling, and she had not looked at the main screen showing the Ironville in quite some time, because she did not need to. She knew it was there. She had always known it was there. She had probably known it was coming before she boarded the transport to Waypoint Aldris. Yuno thought about that. He thought about the 11 years humanity had held provisional membership, quiet years, cooperative years, years in which humanity had attended every session, filed every required document, asked good questions, and caused no trouble at all. He thought about what else they might have been doing during those 11 years. He flagged a request for a direct channel to the Ironville's commanding officer. The response came back in under a minute. Request approved. Channel open at your convenience, Arbiter. Yuno straightened in his seat. He told himself he was not nervous. He was an arbiter of the galactic conclave. He had managed crises between species that could end civilizations. He opened the channel. The man who appeared on the screen did not look like what Yuno expected. He had expected someone performing authority, medals, rigid posture, the specific kind of stillness that military officers used when they wanted to remind you of what they commanded. Yuno had met enough fleet commanders from enough species to know the posture by heart. Admiral Orrin Hale was sitting in what appeared to be a small briefing room somewhere aboard the Ironville. He wore a standard uniform, no medals visible. He had a cup of something warm near his right hand and a small stack of paper documents beside it, actual paper, which struck Yuno as deeply unusual for a man commanding the most advanced warship currently in the system. He looked like someone who had just stepped out of a meeting and had another one coming. He said good afternoon, Arbiter, and asked if the channel quality was acceptable on Yuno's end. Yuno said it was fine. The whole chamber was watching. Every delegate, every aide, Gorzin patched in from his command ship, Sovi in the gallery above with her recording running. Nobody spoke. Nobody wanted to miss a word. Hale said he understood the conclave had been working through the border situation, and he appreciated the time the delegates had given to the matter. Then, Without any particular change in tone, he addressed it directly. He said that 12 days ago, Volkai navigational infrastructure was placed inside territory registered to humanity under conclave provisional membership agreements. He said that 7 days ago, Volkai patrol craft were logged moving through that same territory without prior notification or diplomatic clearance. He said that humanity had filed the appropriate formal objection 11 days ago, before either of those events, because their monitoring systems had indicated the moves were coming. He paused there just briefly, then he continued. He said humanity was not asking the conclave to intervene. He said humanity was informing the conclave of the following. The Volkai infrastructure would need to be removed from Terran-registered space within 72 hours, and Volkai patrol routes would need to return to their pre-incident boundaries within the same window. He said this was not a request. He used that word specifically. Not a request. Goss stood up. He said, loud enough that the audio feed picked it up clearly, that humanity had no standing to issue deadlines to the Volkai hegemony. He said the hegemony had been a conclave member for 6 centuries. He said provisional members did not dictate terms to established powers. He asked, with the specific edge of someone who wanted the question on the record, whether humanity understood what it was doing. Hale looked at Goss on the feed. He took a small sip of his drink. Then he said calmly that he appreciated the question. He said humanity understood exactly what it was doing. He said humanity had been a quiet and cooperative member of the conclave for 11 years and intended to remain so. He said humanity respected the Volkai hegemony's long history and significant contributions to conclave stability. He said none of that changed what he had just said. Goss asked if this was a declaration of war. The chamber went very still. Hale thought about the question, not for a long time, maybe 3 or 4 seconds, but visibly, as if he was genuinely considering how to answer it accurately. Then he said, "No, a declaration of war is something you send when you are not certain of the outcome." Nobody said anything. Goss sat down. Yuno found his voice. He said that the conclave would need time to consult with all relevant parties on the appropriate procedural response to this situation. He said that he hoped Admiral Hale would allow that process to proceed. Hale said of course. He said the Ironville would remain at its current position through the 72-hour window and was happy to receive any further communications. He said his crew had everything they needed and there was no urgency on his end. He said it the way someone says there is no urgency when they are sitting in the warmest, driest room in a building, and the weather outside does not concern them. Yuno thanked him. Hale thanked Yuno in return and said he had genuinely found the Arbiter's long record of service impressive when he reviewed it before the channel opened. He said it with what appeared to be complete sincerity. Then he said goodbye and the screen went dark. The chamber was silent for a moment that stretched. Then Lieutenant Sierra Voss, aboard the Ironville, leaned close to Commander Dax Rule at the station beside her and said, very quietly, that she thought it went well. Rule said he thought so too. Then he told her to get Sector 3 on the maintenance report by end of shift because the Admiral didn't like backlogs. Voss pulled up the report. Down in the lower decks, Private Toma Bren was finishing his lunch and telling the person across from him that whoever designed the meal rotation had clearly never eaten food before in their life. The Ironville sat in the dark outside, Waypoint Aldris, and waited. Back in the chamber, Analyst Sophie was already writing. Sophie did not go to her assigned quarters that night. She stayed in the observer's gallery with the lights turned low and a full database access terminal open in front of her, and she read. Not the summary files. Not the briefing documents that got circulated to delegates before sessions. The actual records. The full historical archive on humanity, going back as far as the conclave had entries, cross-referenced with independent sources from 3 other member species who had made contact with Earth in the early years. She had done this kind of deep reading before, on other species, in other situations. She was good at it. She knew how to move fast through large amounts of information and pull out the things that mattered. 2 hours in, she stopped moving fast. She had reached a section she had skimmed before in previous work, because on the surface it looked like standard pre-contact history. The wars humanity had fought against itself before it reached the stars. She had noted them before as evidence of a violent species that had, under the pressure of expansion and first contact, managed to stabilize into something cooperative, a common enough pattern. She read them carefully this time. Humanity had, in the space of 1 century alone, fought conflicts that killed numbers she had to check twice because they seemed wrong, and then rebuilt, not slowly, quickly, with a kind of systematic driven energy that ran through the records like a current. Every time something was destroyed, they built it back larger. Every time a system failed, they replaced it with something more durable. They did not accept the new normal that catastrophe tried to impose on them. They pushed back against it. She found the section on the Ironville program. It had started 63 years ago. A quiet internal proposal from a human defense committee, never made public, never announced to the conclave during the membership application process, because it predated formal membership by decades. The original proposal described a need for, and she read the exact language carefully, a strategic asset of sufficient scale to render direct military engagement with any known or projected external threat inadvisable for the aggressor. They had built it for this. Not for this specific moment, not for the Volkai or Waypoint Aldris, but for the general shape of this situation. A moment when something large and established would push against humanity and expect them to fold. They had seen it coming before they even left their own solar system. She sat back in her chair and thought about that for a long time. Preth came in around the second hour. He had a drink in each hand, and he set one near her elbow without asking if she wanted it. He sat down and looked at her screen. He asked what she had found. She told him about the construction timeline. 63 years, multiple generations of funding across multiple human governments, which meant the project had survived political changes, economic crises, and shifts in leadership that would have killed most long-term programs in most species. Preth said that was impressive planning. Sovi said it wasn't planning. Planning was what you called it when you made a decision and executed it. What she was looking at was something more like a cultural reflex. The humans hadn't built the Ironville because someone decided to. They had built it because, at some level, deep in the way they approached problems, they simply could not help preparing. Preth thought about that. Then he asked whether she thought they had more ships like it. Sovi didn't answer, because at that moment Gorzin's priority message came through on her station. She opened it. The Volkai fleet in the disputed zone had begun withdrawal, not after the 72-hour deadline, not after any formal response from the conclave. 6 hours and 17 minutes after Admiral Hale closed the channel, Volkai ships had started quietly moving back to their pre-incident positions. The relay station inside Terran territory had been powered down. No announcement, no statement, no response to the human delegation at all. They had simply started undoing what they had done, with no fanfare and no explanation. Preth read the message over her shoulder. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that the Volkai had been in the conclave for 600 years, and he had never seen them back down from anything. Sovi said she knew. He asked why they had done it. She thought about the Ironville sitting outside in the dark. She thought about Hale's face when he said the words "not a request." She thought about the heat signatures at the front of the ship, weapons running warm, not because they were about to be used, but because keeping them warm at all times was simply how you operated a ship like that. She thought about 12,000 people eating lunch and running maintenance drills, while the Galactic Conclave held its breath on the other side of a hull. She said, because they looked at that ship and understood something about the people who built it. Preth asked what. She said that the Volkai had been powerful for a long time. They knew what powerful looked like. And what was sitting outside this station did not look like a young species trying to seem dangerous. It looked like a species that had been preparing, quietly and patiently, for longer than anyone realized, and had simply not had a reason to show anyone yet. That, she said, was not a thing you tested twice. Preth didn't say anything after that. Sophie went back to her reading. Outside, the Ironville sat still and dark and enormous, and the system around it was very, very quiet. The Volkai seat was empty. That was the first thing every delegate noticed when the conclave chamber reconvened on the third day. No message had been sent. No formal withdrawal from the session filed. The seat was simply empty, and the Volkai delegation's assigned quarters in the station had been vacated during the night. Yuno looked at the empty seat for a moment. Then he called the session to order. He read a short statement. The border situation had been resolved. Volkai infrastructure had been removed from Terran-registered space and patrol routes had returned to pre-incident boundaries. The matter was, for the purposes of the official record, closed through diplomatic process. He did not specify whose diplomacy. He did not mention the Ironville by name. He moved on to other business. Nobody questioned the language. It was a strange session, quieter than usual. Delegates who normally jostled for speaking time sat back and let things pass. The kind of quiet that settles over a room when something has shifted and everyone knows it but nobody wants to say so out loud. The human delegation sat at their table as they always had. Aren had his notes. Sable was listening. The young aide was reading again. They participated when the agenda reached items relevant to humanity. They did not gloat. They did not reference the previous 3 days in any way. They behaved exactly as they had in every other session, which, Yuno was beginning to understand, was itself a form of communication. After the session ended, Yuno sent a personal request to the Ironville. He asked if Admiral Hale would be willing to meet privately before the ship departed. Not a formal channel, not on the record, just 2 people with things they wanted to understand. The reply came quickly. Hale said he would be glad to. He suggested they meet in one of the station's small conference rooms, neutral ground, and said he could be there within the hour. He arrived exactly when he said he would. He was shorter than the screen made him appear, and he carried the same quality in person that he had on the channel, a stillness that did not read as tension, but as someone who had simply resolved most of the questions other people were still wrestling with. He shook Yuno's hand with the specific warmth of someone who meant it, and he sat down across from him and waited. Yuno thanked him for coming. Hale said it was a pleasure. There were things Yuno wanted to ask. About the Ironville's construction. About how many years humanity had been quietly building toward this. About what the human government had said when the situation with the Volkai first appeared on their monitoring systems, and whether anyone in that conversation had been surprised. He asked none of those things. He asked only one question. He said he wanted to know if Hale was willing to say how many ships like the Ironville humanity had. Hale looked at him for a moment. Then he smiled. It was a genuine smile, not a diplomatic one, and there was something in it that was almost kind. He said, "Enough." Yuno nodded. He had expected that answer. He appreciated that Hale had not dressed it up. He thanked the Admiral for his time. Hale stood and thanked Yuno in return and said, before he left, that he hoped the Conclave's work got easier from here. He said it sincerely. He was already in the corridor before Yuno fully processed what he meant. From here, as if something had just changed, as if a line had been crossed that reorganized what came after it. Yuno sat alone in the conference room for a while. Aboard the Ironville, the departure sequence had been running for the past hour. Lieutenant Voss was cycling through final system checks at her station, marking off items in the precise, methodical way she did everything. Commander Rule was in the lower decks signing off on the maintenance report he had asked for 2 days ago. The crew was moving through the familiar patterns of a ship preparing to leave, organized and unhurried. Private Toma Bren was standing at one of the long observation windows near the midsection, looking out at Waypoint Aldris growing smaller as the Ironville backed slowly away from its holding position. He had a half-eaten food pack in one hand. The food was still terrible. He watched the station and the small distant shapes of the Conclave escort fleet and the dark open space around all of it. He was 23 years old and had been aboard the Ironville for 8 months, and he still thought it was the strangest and most remarkable thing he had ever been part of, though he would not have used those words if asked. He would have said it was fine. Good posting. Can't complain. The Ironville finished its departure arc, and the engines came up to full power, and the station fell behind, and then the stars stretched and then it was gone. Sophie filed her intelligence report that afternoon. She had been working on it since the night in the gallery with the low lights and the full archive open. The final paragraph was short. She wrote that humanity's observed behavior throughout the incident suggested a species that did not use military assets as instruments of intimidation, because intimidation implied uncertainty about the outcome. She wrote that what humanity appeared to possess was something different, a quiet and deep patience, and the habit of building things not for the argument in front of them, but for every argument after it. She wrote her recommendation at the bottom. Update classification from minimal to OBSERVED. Handle with respect. She submitted the report and closed the terminal and went to find something to eat. Outside, the space where the Ironville had been was just space, dark and empty and still, but something about it felt different than it had 4 days ago, when the ship had not yet arrived and nobody had known what was coming. It felt like a space that something very large had passed through and left its shape behind in the air.